Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares, and in this video I wanted to talk about translating a reference object into pixel art, using what I like to call pixel vision, which is a superpower that every pixel artist develops to help them assess an object for its details and decide how to simplify those details into a stylized pixel art representation. And there's kind of two different ways to go about it, so let's get into it. If we're creating a standalone artwork without any pre-existing constraints to conform to, then one of the easiest ways to get started is just by scanning over the object and focusing in on the smallest details that we'd like to appear visibly in the pixel art design. For example, if we're making this Nintendo Switch into pixel art, maybe we decide that we want the little plus sign button to be completely visible still, rather than being reduced to a point where it's no longer recognizable. This is pretty simple because we can start by making that plus sign out of a single width of pixels, and then use that scaling as a reference point to size out the rest of the design, using the actual object or a photo of it for comparison. Since we've chosen a small detail like the plus sign button as a reference point, this leaves enough room to add some finishing details like simple shading and lighting. At this sizing, you'll notice that we weren't able to quite capture the lettering and round shape of the ABXY buttons though. If that was the objective, then it'd be important to size out those details first and then continue building out from there. I think you can tell just from this comparison that the final pixel art with that kind of sizing would end up being quite large. I mean, for reference, just these 4 buttons here are already about as tall as the NES Mega Man sprite. To show you what I mean about sizing, let's make the Switch again, but even smaller. This time we'll still represent the position of the plus button, but rather than resolving the plus sign shape entirely, let's just make it a single pixel. People that are familiar with Switch controllers will know what it's meant to be in context. From here, the ABXY buttons are also appropriate to size with single pixels, and we can grow the rest of the design out from that reference sizing and positioning. There's even just enough room to add a little bit of lighting and shading like we had on the larger version. By this approach, the reference point for details becomes a very important factor for the outcome of the pixel art. And that's why certain non-essential details, like the letters on the buttons for example, are simplified or eliminated entirely in a pixel art style. Depending on what details we choose to emphasize and maintain, we end up with kind of an exponential effect on the size of the overall artwork. Let's hop to another example though. What if we're making a video game or working on a larger piece of art that has pre-existing size constraints already in place? Like, let's say we wanted to recreate this radio within the sizing and style of the top-down pixel art world of the original Game Boy Pokemon game, which uses base sizing of 8x8 tiles for its objects. Well, we might first choose an appropriate area for the object based on its expected size within that world. So let's take an area of 16x16 pixels to work within. We could start by creating an outline or silhouette of the main shape, roughly approximating the relative length and width as best we can within this space. And I'm including some extra pixels along the top edge to convey that top-down perspective for this style. From here, it's about noticing the size relationships of the various details within the object, and replicating those as accurately as possible into the pixel art. So we might notice the difference between the large and small dials on the radio, and interpret those as different sized pixel clusters. In this case, the large dial is 2x2 pixels, and the small dials are just a single pixel each. Next to the large dial is the tuning range for the radio stations, and this can be approximated as a black bar for now, paying close attention to the fact that we need to leave a single pixel of gap on all sides of it so it doesn't join into the adjacent areas. And the same goes for the position of the speaker. And after a bit of finishing touches, this radio is looking pretty good to fit within this game style. Again, as far as detail goes, there's a lot that got lost in translation. There's no meaningful or readable way to fit in the numbers along the tuning range, the nameplate on the speaker, or the labels next to the dials. But these are the kind of sacrifices that lead to the sort of stylization we end up with for small-scale pixel art. As a bit of a demonstration, let's see what happens when we start with a sizing of 32 pixels instead of 16. Again, we can start by placing those same reference details as before, but now there's more space to convey a bit more shape and detail to them. And just for fun, let's finish it off with a bit of a side perspective rather than top-down. Notice now that we've been able to represent most of the features the radio has to offer, including the decorative cut along the face, the nameplate on the speaker, and even the labels next to the dials. I mean, they're difficult to read at this resolution, but they're there. So I guess my point is that it doesn't take much to get to a resolution where you're able to form some representation of your object. It's just a balance of finding the right sizing based on the level of detail you hope to achieve, or the space that it needs to occupy for a certain purpose. And one last thing, when employing your pixel vision, it's also important to look for tricky angles and corners. A lot of objects in the real world, actually most of them, won't be set up to give us clean lines and curves when made into a pixel art style. A useful way around this is to constrain the geometry, such as using a perfect slope of discrete segments to represent a particular angle, rather than trying to be faithful to angles that wouldn't lend themselves to a clean pixel art representation. It obviously varies on a case-by-case basis, but it's often an important element of creating clean-looking pixel art. Alright, that'll do it for this one. Good luck developing your own sense of pixel vision. Thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.